Networking Part 1. In this nugget, we'll be talking about networking, and this will be Part 1. The first thing we'll discuss here is various kinds of network models. We'll primarily discuss peer-to-peer, server-client, and then we'll also discuss WAN or LAN models. We'll also discuss network topologies, and that really takes us through the end of this video because we have quite a few different kinds of terms and connections that we need to discuss before we move on to our next video. You know, I had a really interesting experience a couple of weeks ago as I was going to church. You see, a minivan pulled into the parking lot, and I looked through the windshield and thought I recognized the driver. He got out of the minivan and took his wife and many children with him to the front door of the church, and I thought I recognized him, so I thought I'd just go ahead and ask. I said, "Hey, are you Kurt Warner?" He said, "Yes, I am." Well, I was just astounded. I've always been a big fan of Kurt Warner, who's the quarterback for the Arizona Cardinals. Now, don't laugh. They're going to get better, especially hopefully with Kurt Warner there. But Kurt Warner won a Super Bowl a few years back, so definitely he's no slouch. Well, anyway, I think I probably totally made an idiot of myself. In case you're wondering, he does look pretty much like he does on television. He's a real handsome guy. He's a lot taller than I expected, but then again, I kind of have this secret fantasy that all athletes are really about my same size. But in reality, he's a pretty tall guy, and he has these big, beefy hands when you shake his hand, just like, you know, you'd think that he could just crush your hand. I guess it's good for gripping that football. And he has that really nice salt and pepper hair. I guess, of course, I'm jealous of just about anybody that has hair. Heck, I think I even envy Carrot Top. Well, you know, you can also have a quarterback in networking. Did you realize that? Sure enough, you can. I mean, you can either play kind of a weekend Sunday afternoon football game where really nobody's in charge and you're all playing flag football or touch football, or you can have a real NFL game where you have a quarterback that's really in charge. And that's kind of the difference as well when it comes to our network models here also. And you see your network models are similar to quarterbacking because you have some situations where you might have a Sunday afternoon game where nobody in particular is in charge. That would be a peer-to-peer kind of a network where there's no central authentication, there's no services, and it's only going to be best for small networks. Let's go ahead and take a look at an illustration for that. So that if I've got a peer-to-peer network here, which is, by the way, this item right here in the middle is a logical representation of a network, and they're probably all connected through some kind of a hub or a switch. And then each one of these users has their own computer, and they have their own logon account on each one of these computers. But if I want to access a printer or a share on this person's computer from this computer, then this user here has to create a username and a password for me that's exactly the same as my username and password that I used to log on to this local computer. Well, that's kind of a security risk as well, because unless I really, really trust these people, then this person here knows the logon to my computer, and they can access anything that I have on there, check my email, do all kinds of things. And then if I change my password at some time in the future, then I will no longer be able to access the share that this person has. And I'll just, for illustration's sake, put, you know, a folder out here. Maybe I have a shared folder. That's an S for a shared folder. Well, so if I change my password, then I have to communicate that to this person. They have to, of course, again, have created a username and password for me in an account on this computer, and then they would change my password. If I forget to tell them about my changed password, I can no longer access that share. Same would be true if they had a shared printer, for example. So there's not really one catalog, so to speak, that contains everybody's username and password where they'll be able to authenticate against that one computer and then access resources throughout the entire network. So that problem with the user accounts goes to the fact that there's no central authentication. We also have no services. If we go back to this network, where are we all storing our data? Chances are everybody's storing the data locally on their own computer in their My Documents folder. Well, if that's the case, what if this user's computer blows up and their hard drive dies? What happens to all of their data? It's gone for good. Now, you know, maybe they had the forethought to create a DVD or a CD backup of it or something like that, but most of the time, that's just not the way it is. People do not back up their data. Or they do have a backup, and it's 8 months old. Another thing that we don't have is any other kind of service, such as name resolution for internet names. We don't have anything that would resolve internal names here as well. We'll talk about all those kinds of things. It might sound like just a bunch of words right now, but some of the things that a server does. It helps to resolve names for us. In most organizations, you'll also have antivirus software on each one of your clients that will prevent new viruses from getting downloaded to your hard drive or being stored in memory. However, many places also have a central server that periodically can scan these remote computers as well, or update each one of these remote computers with the latest virus definitions. Or it may also send updates and security fixes and patches and service packs and the like to all of these computers as well. But without those kind of centralized services, each one of these users has to be responsible for going out to the internet or going out to Microsoft's Windows Update website, downloading the latest updates, installing them on their computer if they have administrative privileges. And so you can see where this goes. We have a kind of an unknown state here where we're really not sure if everybody's been patched against the latest virus or security vulnerability, and it only takes one person who's not protected to make the entire network vulnerable. And like I said again, that might actually be okay if it's a very small family-owned business where everybody trusts each other and you have someone that has reasonable technical capabilities that can manage that small network, maybe that's okay. But you're really much better off in most situations in a client-server type of an environment. Now, of course, I'm a computer geek, so in my small business, I have client-server even if I might not necessarily need it. Even in my home, I have client-server. I have a server, a Windows Server 2003 server that manages the updates for everybody else, all the other computers and laptops and everything that I have in my own home. And in the client-server kind of a network model, I have central authentication. I have any services that I could possibly want, really, and it's very scalable, which means that I can make it really, really big if I wanted to. I don't think it will happen in my environment, but certainly in business, you're going to have to be able to have that, where you're going to go pretty large in many cases. This kind of illustrates what you might see in a client-server environment. Here we would have all of our usernames and passwords. Users. I'll just put user accounts right here. User accounts all exist on this server. So I can log on to this computer and I get authenticated against the server, and then I continue to log on to the computer and use any of the resources that are available to me. Now tomorrow, maybe this person here is sick and I'm supposed to sit at their desk. Well, instead of using my laptop, I can go sit at this person's desk, log on with the same exact credentials, and since my credential checking is through a centralized location of the same server, then I can get authenticated against that server and continue to log on to the network and access this computer. I don't have to have a separate user account on this computer, and another one on this computer, and another one on this computer, and so forth. I also have centralized resources. So for example, in a lot of Windows environments, you have something called Windows Software Update Services, where this server here can be configured to automatically go to the internet on a scheduled basis, download the latest patches, fixes, updates, and onto the hard drive of this server, and then an administrator will approve those updates for distribution throughout the network. All they have to do is to click something, and then automatically that update will be applied to all of these computers, and I can have the assurance of mind and the peace of mind that all of my systems are then protected against whatever that latest vulnerability is. So that centralized service is very handy for me. Another thing that this can be useful for is other services such as DNS or WINS. Now, DNS resolves internet-style names where you have, computer1.company.com or something like that. WINS will resolve flatnet BIOS names, and we'll discuss these in a little bit more detail as we go. But rather than each one of these computers doing their own name resolution, where they have to kind of shout out a name all the way across the network until someone finally answers with the right name, instead we have a server here which has kind of a phone book of names that can keep track of who's who and where they can be located on the network. We also have centralized print services here because this server is always going to be on. If someone goes on vacation or something or is sick for the day, this server's not turned off. This is usually on 24/7. And if I have this as a print server to this printer here, then it's always going to be available to all of these users. And once again, they can use whatever their user credentials were to access that resource. Also, it has storage in many cases. So that I might have a RAID array in here. We talked about RAID in a previous nugget, which has a huge amount of storage that's probably not feasible or likely to be stored on a laptop, for example, or on some of the smaller hard drives in some computers. Instead, I have a really large, maybe a terabyte worth of storage, for example, which is increasingly affordable. And then when my users are using that data, they're actually using it across the network. And I can configure this in such a way that they still use it through My Documents, but without their knowledge, their My Documents has actually been moved to this server where I can perform nightly backups of the data. And with some Windows services, it can automatically be backed up even twice a day using something called volume shadow copy. It's not technically a backup, but it kind of creates a point-in-time backup of that data. And then we can also perform regular virus scans against everybody's centralized storage to where they all keep their own documents. Other things that can take place with this is that we can have the server kind of be the portal to the internet. So anybody who wants to access the internet, they might go through this server. This server can have the function of a proxy server. We'll talk a little bit more about that in our networking section here. But the short version of what a proxy server can do for us is it adds to security so that people will not be able to identify my computer here out there on the internet. It's concealed from the internet public. And the other thing it does is it helps to prevent people from going to blacked out websites. That means blacklisted sites that are inappropriate for the workplace, for example. That's another function of a proxy server. I might as well write that in here, proxy. And then here I have a picture of a firewall. A lot of times a proxy server and a firewall are synonymous. That might be a proxy server type software on the server, so these wouldn't really be two pieces in that case. The firewall would be the server. Or you might have it as a separate network appliance of some kind, and a lot of these are kind of one-size-fits-all things right now, and they can do spam filtering, they can do firewall services, they can do proxy services, all kinds of things to protect you from the malicious internet. But once again, this differs from the peer-to-peer network in that I have a centralized location for management here. I've got a lot of powerful services that I can use, and I've got good security from the internet. And then we can further expand that out when we get into something called a WAN. Now, let's start off first of all with what a LAN is. A LAN is a local area network. That's what we showed you just a moment ago when I showed you the peer-to-peer network. That would still be a LAN because there are several computers connected to the same network locally. The same would be true of a client-server network. They're still all computers on a local area network. But we might need to contact some other network. Maybe this is my Buffalo office, and maybe this over here is my Denver office. And we have resources that we need to exchange, files we need to send back and forth, email we need to send back and forth. And so we need to maintain some connectivity. If that's the case, I might set up a WAN connection here. Now, a lot of times that kind of gets fuzzy with the internet because a lot of WAN connections now can use the internet through something like a virtual private network, which encrypts in a highly secure fashion all of our network traffic between us. So that way, even though my traffic is out there on the internet public and where anybody could possibly access it, it's all encrypted in such a way that all they're going to be able to see is gibberish, and they won't really have any idea what this network is saying to this network. And again, that would be called a VPN, or a virtual private network. That's not an A+ objective, but as I brought it up, I might as well write it down. Now, in some situations, there might be a highly paranoid security situation where their internet is not allowed to be trusted, even if you're using a secure VPN. If that's the case, then you might have a dedicated WAN link. And this could be high speed, low speed, doesn't really matter the speed. What that would be is a dedicated connection that normally you get from your telephone company, and we also call those just telcos for short. And they might set up for you a dedicated ISDN line here, for example, or a dedicated T1 or a dedicated fractional T1, and all of those things we'll discuss as well. But those are telephone company type of connections that can either be used for dedicated access from one network to the other like we have here, or you can also use those to access the internet, but it just depends on how you want to configure those. If it's a dedicated WAN, then the internet is not available here at all. Now then, let me quickly address some other things that we'll need to know in terms of A+ objectives relating to network technologies. I kind of alluded to some of these a little while ago. And one of those things that we will have to have is an internet service provider, or an ISP. That's just a term that you need to be able to define. The ISP is often going to be that telephone company that I talked about just a moment ago. They might set up that ISDN line, that DSL line, that whatever it is. Very often nowadays in the United States anyway, we have cable modem providers, which are the same providers that also provide your cable TV service. The ISP is simply a company that can get you a connection from your house or residence or business out to their own internet locations or their internet backbones, which then puts you out on the internet. Then there's also an issue of bandwidth. Bandwidth is simply a measure of how much data can go through a given communication channel at one time. And this is measured in terms of seconds. So I might say that something is so many bits per second in speed, or kilobits per second, or megabits per second. Sometimes you'll also hear this called the data throughput, or maybe the line speed. Another thing that's increasingly common both in business and in residential use is voice over IP. For example, in my home and in my small office for my business, I use Vonage, vonage.com, and that's what I use for all of my phone service. I really can't tell the difference between them and when I used to use the normal telephone company's phone service. And all voice over IP does is it uses the internet to be able to send your phone conversation to a destination. Now then, we've talked about infrared and Bluetooth in previous nuggets, so I'm not going to elaborate on those too much here. But do just know the bandwidth of infrared, which is capable of, in older standards, in which also a lot of laptops are compatible with this, is 4 megabits per second. And then some other implementations are up to 16 megabits per second. And then the Infrared Data Association says that on the horizon we have 100 megabits and 500 megabits per second that are upcoming at some time in the future. With Bluetooth, there's a couple of versions here, key versions. That would be version 1.2, which was good for 1 megabit per second, 1 megabit. I'm doing lowercase b for megabit instead of megabyte, for 1 megabit per second. And then version 2.0 is good for up to 3 megabits per second. Megabits per second. And then another thing that's kind of cool here is cellular access. A lot of people I've seen nowadays are using those PC cards in their laptops, so that if maybe they have Verizon, then they can actually use the Verizon cell phone service through that PC card to access the internet. My brother-in-law, in fact, did that. We were just driving down to some mountains a little while ago, and he had his laptop with him the whole time, and wherever he could have cell service in the moving car, he also had internet access. I keep telling myself that I should get this as well, but I don't want to spring $59 or $69 a month for that kind of thing. I'll just wait till I get to the office and use the internet. And then I went ahead and wrote all of this offline because I didn't want you to have to wait for me to write all this. But there's two popular standards in the United States. One of those is the Global System for Mobile Communications, and this one is capable of 270 kilobits per second up and down. There's another one, however, that gives better speed, and that would be the Code Division Multiple Access, or CDMA. With this one, we can get 3 megabits per second download, 2 megabits per second upload. And then we'll also talk about wireless networks, which are very common nowadays in the corporations as well as for home users. But I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more of a broader detail a little bit later on here. So we'll just come back to that one in a little bit. But generally, on their own, they're capable of up to about 54 megabits per second with an 802.11g standard. And then as we continue our discussion of other network technologies, most all of these relate to internet services. And the first one would be Integrated Services Digital Network, which came out pretty much in the 80s, and it used conventional copper wire, telephone wire, to be able to carry digital signals. You see, normally with like a voice conversation, it'll carry analog signals, and their electrical impulses vary slightly to give the differences in volume and tone and pitch that we normally receive on a conventional telephone call. Well, instead of those electrical impulses, now it sends digital data across that line instead, and it will connect using something called an ISDN terminal adapter. Some people call those an ISDN modem, but that's not technically accurate because a modem modulates and demodulates between analog and digital data. Whereas with an ISDN connection, you're dealing only with digital data. Now then, ISDN is capable of about 2 megabits per second. I'll just write that down here, megabits per second. But normally you're going to see 128 kilobits per second be much more common. With ISDN, what we have here is something called a B channel. B stands for bearer, or B-E-A-R-E-R channels. Each of the bearer channels can carry 64 kilobits per second of data. Now for basic service, you'll have something called a basic rate interface, or BRI, ISDN line. It'll use 2 B channels, and that's where you're going to get the 128 kilobits per second, because 64 plus 64 kilobits per second, of course, equals 128. And with ISDN, you can use one channel for a voice call also, and the other channel can be used for data transmission. The other kind of channel you can get is something known as a D channel. This is also sometimes known as the signal channel or the delta channel. It only has 16 kilobits per second worth of data bandwidth. Now this channel is not used for your main internet service to send and receive files and things like that. It's primarily just used for being able to set up the link and to manage the signals. Now, in a corporation that used ISDN, they might need, of course, more speed than just 2 megabits per second. So what they can do is they can use a primary rate interface, or PRI. This is going to use 23 bearer channels plus the delta channel. And so when you multiply 23, or actually 24, including the delta channel, times 64, you can get a total amount of line bandwidth of 1,536 kilobits per second. But anyway, that's enough about ISDN because, again, it's kind of becoming a defunct standard in favor of other technologies such as DSL. DSL is a very reliable service, and a lot of people use this because, again, it uses their existing phone lines. With DSL, you don't have to make a dial-out connection like you have to make with ISDN, and DSL is also increasingly capable of higher and higher speeds. One of the disadvantages, however, of DSL is it's not available in all areas because you have to live within a certain range of the telephone company's central office or other amplification equipment. So usually it's going to be around a mile. Also, if you're in an area where maybe you live in a really old housing development or an old apartment where the telephone lines are not in that great a shape, if they're not giving a clean signal, then also, again, you might not be able to use DSL. Another advantage, though, of DSL is that you can use the DSL line and surf the internet while you're simultaneously using an analog signal along that same copper for your phone conversations. And these also require a certain kind of specialized equipment. Sometimes they look a lot like a cable modem, if you've ever seen those. But they're a small device that is called a DSL endpoint. Sometimes people call them DSL modems, but once again, the data is all digital, so that's kind of a misnomer. Those DSL endpoints can either be internal or external. It can be something that fits in a PCI slot in your computer, or it can be a freestanding device that you plug into, and then you plug in a network connection into it instead. And if you want to see if DSL service is available in your area, you can go to a website, this is not an A+ thing, it's just FYI, a website called dslreports.com, and then it'll also give you information about what's available for DSL for you. Now, one of the advantages of both ISDN and DSL is that they are dedicated connections. If I have another office next to me in the office building that also has DSL, well, we have nothing in common with one another. We're not sharing the same data lines or anything, whereas with a cable, you are. A cable modem actually does modulate and demodulate signals between analog and digital. They are extremely fast. In fact, in my area right now, I can get upgraded service so that I can get up to 9 megabits per second download speed and a megabit per second upload speed. However, in most areas, you're more likely to see something like around 3 megabits per second. That's still extremely fast, though, compared to some of our other technologies. And this, of course, is going to use the same cable that you get for your cable TV service, and we call it broadband because it can handle multiple kinds of data signals at the same time. That's why you're able to watch television in one room while someone else in another room is simultaneously accessing the internet over a cable modem. But a drawback to this might be that, depending on your area, you're really sharing your cable modem, your cable access, with everybody else because all the lines connect through a central location. And so anybody else that's within your segment of that cable modem network will potentially be able to see your network data. Now, most cable service providers have security measures to prevent people from seeing each other's network data or computers on the network. I know in my area, they had a changeover at one time, and so for 2 or 3 days, those security measures were down, and I was actually able to see other people's data directly on their computer for a while. But fortunately, that doesn't happen very often anymore. Now, if none of these other technologies are available, you might need to go to satellite technology instead. And this is often the case in rural areas or where they don't have phone lines available or they don't have the quality of phone lines they need for a DSL connection. With this, you have a satellite that can download information from an ISP, and then you may upload information through a normal phone line. So you might have to have plain old telephone service or POTS available for your uploads. Or a lot of satellite services nowadays will give you bidirectional capabilities all through a satellite. So you don't need a phone line for that kind of technology. But again, if given a choice, most people would rather have DSL or cable. I kind of prefer cable over satellite unless you just absolutely have no other choice. All right, then I kind of got behind on running down our bandwidth, so you can read those for yourselves in terms of how fast each one of these can be. A lot of these, like DSL, for example, you might get 256 for a bargain basement price, but if you pay an upgrade price, you can get kind of a corporate speed of 10 megabits per second. Same with cable access as well. Then with dial-up, man, this is like the bottom of the barrel for accessing the internet or for dialing into a corporate network remotely. This is going to be, at best, 56 kilobit per second modem. 56, I'll just put K for kilobit per second because I'm tired of writing. And that's the maximum theoretical speed of the modem. But in reality, because of FCC regulations, you're only allowed to go 53 kilobits per second. This takes a long time to connect because it has to use a conventional plain old telephone service or POTS to be able to make the dial-up connection over a regular phone line. And you might have people making these connections using things like America Online. And by the way, it's one of my peeves. It's not American Online, it's America Online. And you might also use other services such as Net Zero or any of those other dial-up service providers that are available to us. And this is increasingly not necessary anymore because I used to travel a lot, and when I'd go to hotels, we didn't have wireless internet access in hotels. So we had to just dial up all the time. Well, in recent years, dial up is just kind of going away. But we'll still need it at times, and most laptops that you buy will still have a modem integrated into it just in case. And then also, and this is just a note for you, not an A+ objective, but if you want to get a good speed test, you can go to a couple of different websites that are available for this. Now, to test your internet connection speed, you can go to one of these couple of websites here. I often go to speed, if I can spell right, test.net. And what this one does is, I like it because it gives you a lot of different locations to choose from. Typically, to get the maximum test speed, you want to choose the one that's closest to you. This website is able to actually detect where I am physically located geographically, and it highlights in yellow the closest one to me. That's Scottsdale. That's just like 20 miles away from where I am. So I'll go ahead and click on that one. It runs a speed test for me here, and it will identify the maximum download speed and upload speed for my connection. And so we see it's running its test here. It tells you how far along the test is. Gives you a fun little graphic to watch as you're doing this as well. And typically mine goes up to around 5 megabits per second. When this is done, it'll also check an upload speed, which is what it's starting to do right now. And once again, this is not an A+ exam objective, but just FYI if you need to test this out, especially for a customer who's complaining that they're not getting fast upload speeds. If they're getting fast upload and download speeds through this kind of a thing, but the website that they're trying to go to seems to be kind of slow, it could be that that website they're hitting is just having technical problems of some kind, or maybe that website is a little overloaded. In this nugget, we discussed networking, and this was part one where we started off with a discussion of various network models like peer-to-peer networking, server-client, and then we also discussed the difference between a LAN and a WAN. Of course, a LAN is a local area network, and a WAN is a wide area network which connects two or more LANs. We also took a look at some of the network technologies that we'll need to know about before we especially move on into our next nugget, and a lot of these network technologies we talked about were internet-related. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.